All right, before we get into this interview with Rod Meldrum, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Scripture Notes. Scripture Notes is an application that I use every day for my scripture study. I use it for my quick study group. I use it with an interview I just did with Val Larson on the Old Testament and the Book of Mormon. I'm able to have numerous different window panes up at the same time with this product. It is transformational. It will change the way that you study your scriptures. It becomes much more enriching and, as I like to say, much more fluid. So go to scripturenotes.com. That's scripturenotes.com and try it out. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have invited Rob Meldrum of the FIRM Foundation. He is the founder. Rod, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here, Greg. So good
to talk about this again. We get
here.
So much attention on the idea of the Heartland versus the Mesoamerican model. You know what else goes right along with this? I want to touch on this also is the translation process. I don't know why, but these two things are brought together firmly and with really a growing chasm between the two of them. So we're going to touch on that as well. I want to start off with this. Well, let me go ahead and just read the mission statement for FIRM Foundation. They get an idea of who you are and what you're trying to do here. The FIRM Foundation, which is the Foundation for Indigenous Research in Mormonism, is an organization dedicated to showing forth evidence for the Book of Mormon in order to provide LDS church members with well-researched information, enabling them to powerfully and respectfully defend its historicity and thus its truthfulness, with the ultimate goal of bringing people unto Christ. So I think that's an important thing. And I hope that we can focus on that, because what I've noticed is there's quite a bit of bantering going on between the Mesoamerican model and the Heartland model. Do you see that? You must see that.
Yeah, probably more so in the beginning than there is now. Maybe it's just because I've been a little bit checked out the last couple of years building a house and so forth. But no, there still is that kind of a bantering back and forth as you mentioned. But in the beginning, it was a little rough. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was rough enough that I was like. At one point, there was an organization that took some pretty hot shots at myself and personally and so forth. And my wife, bless her heart, she said, "You know what? Just do what the church leaders do when they get attacked. Just say this is our position, and don't get into a mudslinging match, because the last thing we want to have is a bunch of high priests at the time slugging it out online." Because that just gives fodder to the other team.
Sure. Yeah. I know.
So we don't do that. So
I know
you
who that
won't find on our
organization
websites.
By the way. So let's start back right from the beginning, Rod, with this, because you've got this large organization. You've got a couple of conferences a year with hundreds of people, maybe more, that show up each time. What started all of this? Why did you start? Did you always believe in a Heartland model? Why was it so important for you to really dedicate now your work toward this?
Well, it's interesting. I kind of like Nephi. I was born of goodly parents, and my dad served in the Central States Mission, and he came back and had 0 convert baptisms, and he was so dejected. He went to BY Academy at the time and met my mom. He said, "Well, maybe if I can't get any converts through missionary work, maybe I can raise up a few converts." So my parents were really committed to the gospel, and we had the whole thing, family home evening. We had scripture study every morning. Raised on a dairy farm, so we had to get up at about 5 or 5:30 in the morning for scripture study. And I was probably the one that gave my parents the most grief about that. I was probably the most rebellious one about that. But over the course of time, we had these living scriptures. And my mom was a zealot when it came down to that stuff, and bless her soul, it really did rub off on me. So was I always a Heartland person? And the answer to that is, as a kid, I remember reading these passages in the Book of Mormon about a mighty Gentile nation above all other nations. It was a land of liberty, a land of freedom, and so forth. And I just kind of felt in my heart of hearts that we're talking about America here. We're talking about the United States. And then I went to seminary and institute and so forth. They said, no, it's down in Central America, and that's where it happened. And I just said, well, these guys are a lot smarter than I am. They've obviously done the research. I haven't. So, I can accept that. That's not a problem. So I fully believe that the Book of Mormon probably happened down in Central America, but it wasn't really a major focus. And it became a major focus for me. And I've told this story a couple of times, but there was a young man. I was a young men's president of our ward, and there was a young man who was not going on a mission for whatever reason, and his family moved out. We helped him move, and his mom shows up at my house with the DVD. It's called DNA versus the Book of Mormon. And she said, Brother Meldrum, you do scientific research, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I said, yeah. And she said, well, you need to watch this. And I said, well, I won't mention her name or whatever, but basically I said, well, Sister Blank, why do I need to see this? She says, because it's true. And she was taking her whole family out of the church at that point in time. And people say, well, they probably had a weak testimony or something. I'm telling you what, this is a lady who did not have a weak testimony. She was converted to the gospel when she was 16 years old, I think in Brazil, and then she was excoriated by her parents and basically kicked out of the house. She had to make her own money and so forth. She came to the United States. She went to BYU. She met Jorge, her husband George, and they had 4 beautiful kids. And anyway, long story short, she's been a Relief Society president twice. She gave up everything to be part of the church, and this DNA thing just threw her for a complete loop. And she was taking her family out of the church, and so it became personal for me. And as I started to study this, I fully expected. Well, first, let me back up just a second, but from a scientific standpoint, if something's true, it's true. It's true in every field. So if it's true in geology, it's going to be true in, chemistry or astronomy or whatever it is. It's truth is universal. And anyway, so long story short is that we had a situation where this science was going on. I guess you kind of mentioned you might want to go into the science thing eventually at some point. But it had a big input on me. So I was working with Dean Sessions and the Universal Model at the time. We had access to some of the top research libraries. And I went to the 2002, I'll never forget the 2002 spring, the General Conference. So it was the April General Conference. And as my family were standing outside, this was right after the Winter Olympics or whatever. And so they had all these new protocols for security and things going on. So we had to stand outside for quite a while. And as I stand outside, I had these big banners that said DNA proves the Book of Mormon's false. And I'm like, number one, how would DNA disprove the Book of Mormon? I mean, that seems like kind of a stretch. And number two is I already know the Book of Mormon is true. What's the answer? Do we have answers, or what are the answers? And so I started to look into that. And what I found was the apologetics community of the church was pretty much on the path that, well, there's no DNA evidence. We admit that. And we don't expect to find any DNA evidence for this and this and this reasons, which we could go into that in detail, but that would be hours. but they said, so basically we don't expect to find any DNA evidence to support or reject the Book of Mormon. It's kind of like, let's take a neutral path, a neutral stance. And I'm kind of like, well, if the Book of Mormon account is correct, there's a pretty big population of people who ultimately over 400 or 500 years are kind of filling the promised land. At least, at least it's a major contributing factor. Their DNA would be a major contributor to the DNA overall of the peoples who are here in the Americas. And I said, well, why can't we find that? What's the deal? Mm-hmm. And so I began to look at the whole DNA question. And as I began, I got to tell you, Greg, that I really felt like that the DNA thing was going to lead to what I had been taught in seminary and institutes classes and so forth about Central America. I mean, the Mayan civilization down there is a massive civilization. It had, pretty amazing, the infrastructure that they had, the buildings that they built, and it's pretty impressive. And so I thought, well, that's where it's going to lead. But then as I did the research, I found that the whole reason why there's a controversy in the first place is because of this DNA. When they sequenced the DNA from the Mayan people today, but also if they go back to the people who are buried in the pyramids down in Central America, they're 100% Asian. I said, well, how can that be if the Book of Mormon is true and they came to Asia? I mean, it's not they came
from Asia.
They came. They're Hebrews. They're not Asians. So that we should find something kind of a link to Hebrew populations, and that's basically the church had been at that point, because of that DNA versus the Book of Mormon. The church was getting kicked in the teeth over this DNA issue. They that little group up in it was called Living Hope Ministries, I think their name was. They had a place right there in Brigham City. I actually went and visited their place. But that video had, at one point in time, they had over 10 million views. And then they were distributing it out to wards and stakes in Utah, Idaho, and Arizona that I know of. They were just sending them out by the boxes full to people because it was devastating. The reason why it was so devastating, Greg, is because it was true. At the time when they put it out, which was 2002, there was no DNA evidence. It wasn't until an interview with President Hinckley during the Winter Olympics, there was a German reporter that asked President Hinckley, says, what's going to be your church's position when DNA analysis shows that there's no DNA evidence for your Book of Mormon, which is you call it the keystone of your religion. And President Hinckley kind of got a little bit perturbed with the guy. He said he kind of scolded. He says, that hasn't been established yet. Nobody knows the answer to that yet. Not at this point. That was in 2002 during the Olympics. And it turns out, I got to say, that was a prophetic statement, because it wasn't until 2003 when articles began to show up in genetics journals like American Journal of Physical Anthropology and other journals that were talking about a new type, a new haplogroup. There's haplogroups, which is the kind of the bigger groups. There's super groups, and there's haplogroups, and there's subgroups called clades. Anyway, and they found out that all of the Native American groups in North, Central, and South America have an Asiatic background, except for one. And they were just finding out about this one that had 5 specific markers in the DNA of these Native Americans, and that 5 markers isn't found in Asian populations anywhere. So they started looking, well, where are these same 5 markers found? And they found them in the Druze population in Israel. They found it in the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardic Jews, the Libyan Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Tunisian Jews. Every Jewish population that was dispersed from the Israel area, from the Levant area of Israel, has these same 5 markers as these Native Americans, and they're not in Central America. They're in North America.
Is this the Hopewell people?
Yeah. So So when they started sequencing DNA from the descendants of the Hopewell people, which are basically the Algonquin-speaking language groups of Native American Indians, which involves about 110 tribes that are Algonquin, or sometimes they call it Algonquian, but there's Algonquin tribes. This is, for example, they're like the Potawatomis, the out here in the West, we know the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Blackfoot. If you look at a Sioux Native American with Sioux background or Blackfoot Indian, okay, and you compare them with like the Navajos or the Hopis out here, whatever, they don't even look anything like each other. They have very different facial features, very different, I mean, they're very different. They have very narrow faces, very European looking faces, versus the Navajo and so forth, which have kind of the wider moon face, basically. And all of a sudden there's these articles coming out saying, well, we found the genetic history of these Algonquins, and they came from the Hopewell. So where did the Hopewell come from? Well, it turns out that the Hopewell have, they've actually sequenced DNA directly from the bones of the ancient Hopewell mound builder civilization, which a lot of people are not familiar with that. That civilization began to show up here in the Americas right around 500 to 600 BC.
Where was that?
What's that?
Where was that?
Around Florida area, in the Florida area, Florida Panhandle, and also the kind of the southwestern part of Florida around Clearwater Beach in that area. There's a bunch of mounds there that are there, and they date them. You know, they mainstream archaeology dates that around about 500 to 600 BC. But then they grew into a massive civilization that they came northwards. Essentially, the mounds began showing up around 200 to 300 BC, up in the middle portion of America, what we call the Heartland of America. That's the reason why we call it the Heartland model, because that's commonly called, it's the most normal thing for that to be called the Heartland of America. Mm-hmm. So we call it the Heartland model because of that. Anyway, so this civilization crescendoed into a massive civilization that had, by accounts clear back in the 1800s, the 1890s surveys that were done said that there were somewhere around 200,000 mounds in the Heartland of America. Well, that's not a small group of hunter-gatherers. That's a pretty major civilization. But newer research, in fact, there's a book that came out about 5 or 6 years ago called the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Native American Mounds and Earthworks. It's about 10 authors in the book. It's a big, thick book, and in that book on page 3,
non-LDS.
Yeah, non-LDS. It's totally not LDS, guys. But they say on page 3 that the biggest question they always get is, how many mounds are there? They said, based on the Bureau of Ethnology original surveys and the surveys that we have now, says we now know that there are well over 1 million mound sites, and many of those sites have 2 or 3 mounds in them. Some of them have up to 9 or 10 mounds. So we're talking about a minimum of 2 to 3 million mounds.
What are the mounds? I mean, they're mounds because there's earth over the top of them. But what are the mounds?
Well, there's different kinds of mounds. There's burial mounds, which is kind of the most common one. There's ceremonial mounds that are placed in very specific areas. There's effigy mounds that are in the form or shape of different things, animals. There's one, in fact, it's called the Charlton Cross, which is in the shape of a cross. There's elephant mounds. There's alligator mounds. There's anyway, a lot of them were defensive. So there was mounds that surrounded cities, or surrounded certain acreages, and that had ditches and had earth banks and so forth. And then through archaeological study, I found that they actually had timbers on the ridges of some of these mounds, like in Hopetown and so forth. Around Ohio is kind of the biggest concentration of mounds that still exist. Most of these mounds have been, let's say probably about 80% of these mounds have been destroyed by farming and looting. I mean, when the first settlers came out, they found all kinds of cool artifacts in there. So they started digging into these mounds and trying to find out what's going on. So a lot of them have been looted, but so back to this whole other story. So I was like, well, okay, so there's this. The DNA evidence is showing maybe North America is a possible setting for the Book of Mormon, but nobody's talking about that. I thought, well, what did Joseph Smith know? I mean, if anybody knows where the Book of Mormon happened, it should be the guy who actually had conversations with these ancient prophets, in his bedroom and in his little, the little, log home that they had there in Palmyra. So what did Joseph Smith know? So that led to a huge study. I wanted to know anything that Joseph Smith said, did. You can tell a lot by what somebody says, but a lot of times what they say was recorded by somebody else and it goes through their filters. So you can tell a lot, actually, even more by what somebody does. And with Joseph Smith in this particular case, he when he was commanded by the Lord to send missionaries to the Lamanites. This is all recorded. These are revelations, so this is not speculation. This is revelation. The Lord in sections 28 and 30 and 32 in the Doctrine and Covenants he commands Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer Jr., as a Party P. Pratt, and Ziba Peterson. What it gives them the very first copies of the Book of Mormon. So I have a couple of them over here. The very first edition of the Book of Mormon just came off the Grandin Press there in Palmyra, and the Lord tells him in section 32, he says, and I myself will go with them. So the Lord tells him, take those copies that just came off the press, you give them to these 4 guys, the very first missionaries ever called, and they were all called to go see the Lamanites. So my question to people has been, Greg, and this is, I know it's a little bit rhetorical, but how many of you believe that God knows where the Lamanites are located? Because if he says that he's going to oversee this missionary journey by these first 4 missionaries with the first copies of the Book of Mormon, I want to know, where did they go? Who did they go see?
Now, wouldn't those on the other side of the argument then say, well, okay, they may be Lamanites, but this is from, another 1,500 years of time and travel and mixture of blood and whatnot, that it could have been Mesoamerica, and now many of the Native Americans in the United States boundary areas are now also have that blood. Wouldn't that be an argument against what you're saying?
It would be, except for the fact that you have this is why the DNA part of it is so impressive and so important, because if it came from Central America and they sequenced the DNA from the people who lived in the times of the Book of Mormon in Central America and they're Asian, how is it that Asian lineage then ends up here in North America and creates a lineage that has the DNA of Hebrews?
How close is that? Though? I haven't looked into the DNA issue enough, but you're saying, I don't know enough about the DNA to say this is what the Hebrews have. You're saying there's larger groups, or is it haplo groups, etc. So there's like, okay, they fit under the same umbrella, but how precise is that compared to what you would find with Jewish blood, say, for example?
Yeah, well, the whole DNA subject we could talk for days about, but
let's keep it shorter on this one. But I just wonder how precise that is, in mapping that over to Israel, essentially.
Yeah, well, that's been one of the big arguments, actually, though, Greg, is that how precise is it? Because we don't even know for sure what Lehi or Sariah or Ishmael or Ishmael's wife, we don't even know her name, what kind of DNA did they in fact have? So so you have to make some assumptions. So you can't nail it down like you could in a court of law. Say, we found this guy's blood on this thing, we can show that he was at the crime scene or whatever. It's not like that kind of thing. There's a lot of speculation. I shouldn't say speculation, but more, there's assumptions that are made in DNA analysis, especially when it comes down to dating of it and so forth, that are based on, sometimes it's observation, sometimes it's just based on someone's theory that they threw out there. So in answer to that, the North American Indians that have the DNA type that links them to Hebrews, they didn't come from Central America. Their ancestry is the Hopewell. We know that, from mainstream genetics, they know that the Hopewell have the same DNA type as the people later on today. They know that the descendants of the Mayans, they can trace those people, and they're the Mayans today. The original Mayans are still the ancestral people to the Mayans that live in Guatemala and southern Mexico and so forth today. So that's one of the reasons that it's one of the arguments against the idea that they basically came up from the South. In fact, I've got articles from mainstream scientific journals that talk about that the DNA migration patterns basically are from the north to the south, not from the south to the north. But the DNA issue is a really important one, because it is used in courts of law, so it's you can't fake your DNA it is what it is. It gets, of course, it gets changed every generation, because every generation you have the chromosomes. So that's why they look at either the paternal line or the maternal line. So if you take a mother's, like a grandmother's DNA, her granddaughters and grandsons would have her DNA, but only her granddaughters would pass her DNA on, her mitochondrial DNA. And the same with the Y chromosomal DNA on the men's side, on the male side. So, but if you look at either one of those, both of them, the male and the female, the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosomal DNA lineages show that the Native Americans in North America are distinct from all the other people. That's the reason why they have these groups. They call them haplogroups. There's haplogroups A, B, C, and D, which are all Asian. And then when they found this other one, they call it haplogroup X. It is still considered one of the 5 founding haplogroups, but it's the only one that's not Asian. And it's the only one that has the DNA markers that match up with all the Israelites. The biggest question has become, Greg, is the dating. When did it arrive here? Because they originally said that the DNA arrived here in America about 40,000 years ago, which by my estimation, and as a I mean, I want to be upfront on everything, basically, and that is that I'm quite conservative, and I'm kind of a traditionalist when it comes down to the gospel. I believe that Joseph Smith and the prior prophets got it right, and our current prophets have it right. And there's no reason to necessarily change it. We have to change some things in the culture, but the family is still the family. Husband and wife is still the best way to raise a family. It's shown time and again with studies, demographic studies and so forth, that kids raised with a mother and father in the home still end up having advantages in life. They seem to do better in life in general. The family structure is something that's important. I'm a traditionalist when it comes down to that. I still think that's the best method. There's
you're saying you're saying you're a traditionalist in terms of timing also.
Yeah. And so from a traditional standpoint, the Book of Mormon is a record that has a lot of political stuff in it. It has a lot of information about these cultures, but the bottom line is that these cultures were here. They didn't migrate up from southern Mexico, and mainstream science shows that. The other interesting thing about this particular culture, the Hopewell culture that we're talking about, who we are associated with the Nephites, is that their civilization rose to power kind of right around the time of Christ. Was their greatest crescendo of power, where they were spreading over the land more. But by about 400 to 500 AD, the civilization completely collapsed, to the point where the next civilization that rose to power is actually called something else. It's called the Mississippian culture, which happened in about a 400 or 500 year lag between the two. That one started around 800 to 900 AD, and then they began to rise to power, and they basically became the dominant culture then.
Okay.
And there was an original culture before that called the Adena, and they match up perfectly with the Jaredite culture.
Okay. So DNA is one issue. So we're talking about physical evidences here. I want to quote something here from a book you wrote with Bruce Porter, a friend of mine here, and this is from Prophecies and Promises, and talking about how you would look at how you would look at different evidences here for geography. Okay, you say the proposed methodology presented in this book utilizes 4 highly corroborative resources that assist in coming to an understanding of the lands described in the Book of Mormon text. These are, 1, the prophetic evidence found in Scripture. We're going to get to that in a minute, because that, to me, more than anything else, I think is the biggest.
Oh, by far.
The biggest chasm between the two sides here. Number 2, the prophetic statements of the inspired translator, Joseph Smith. You've brought that up already. 3, physical evidences, be DNA, for example. And then 4 would be the geographical passages that you would find in the Book of Mormon, which I think is by far the most difficult thing to map and to use as evidence in my mind.
Yeah.
So going back here again to physical evidence, because this is what people are mostly intrigued with. I'm actually intrigued with number 1, the prophetic evidence in the scriptures. But the physical evidence is the big question on all of this is always Cumorah, right? It is the Cumorah conundrum, if you will, right? So you've got Cumorah, which is, I grew up believing that Cumorah was in New York. This is where the plates are found. This is what it always was.
Where the pageant happens, yeah.
The Hill Cumorah pageant. You've got, I mean, this is the tradition. This is what we've been told, and that that it was. It's always been called the Hill Cumorah. That's what I grew up believing, right? And yet, right now, you have let's call it mainstream Latter-day Saint scholarship is saying that their idea on this is that no, this is a different Cumorah, in that it was just called Cumorah, not it wasn't Hill Cumorah.
Yeah.
It was called Cumorah as a representation of the real Hill Cumorah, which is in Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the problem. It's like the one thing we know, even though we don't have the plates, the one thing we know
that's where the plates were,
is where were the plates buried?
Yeah.
Right. That's the one thing we know for physical evidence is this is where the stone box is. This is where these artifacts were found. This is where Moroni took Joseph Smith, was at the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York. Where does this other idea come from that you have that this is not the Hill Cumorah of the Book of Mormon, that this is simply what they began to call it because I don't know why. Why does it all of a sudden change where this is just I know, for example, real quick, that there are statements about this being the Hill Cumorah. They're written down later, several years later. And so, the idea in academia as well, this became the tradition of the early Latter-day Saints to call it Hill Cumorah.
Yeah.
But that's the issue to me is when you boil it all down geographically, it's like, is this Hill Cumorah or not? Right?
Well, and that's basically, I think you've hit it on the head there as far as that's concerned. If the Hill Cumorah is just a symbolic hill in New York, and the real Hill Cumorah is down in some place in Central America, then it obviously, that is a legitimate idea as far as, it's possible. Things do get named symbolically. I mean, we have a Manti, Utah, kind of, we have a Nephi, and so forth here. But this is where I think where it comes down, and that is that there was a lot of different ideas back in the early church about this. And there was, in fact, there's a whole book that Jonathan Neville did about this, which is just phenomenal. It's about the lost city of Zarahemla, but he goes into the historical background. What did Joseph Smith believe? What did others around him believe? There was different ideas. There were some articles that came out in the Times and Seasons that seemed to promote the Central American idea. Joseph Smith was the editor of the Times and Seasons at the time, so it's thought that Joseph Smith must have approved of and agreed with these articles that came out by Winchester, actually. So there's actually a couple different people, but his brother William Smith and Benjamin Winchester were two of the guys that actually were involved with this whole thing on the geography. And I can just end it. Want me to just recap that really quick?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Greg, because basically what happened is that Benjamin Winchester was quite a zealot. In fact, he was on Zion's Camp March. His father was a dear friend of the prophet Joseph, and actually they stayed together many instances overnight in different places and on Zion's Camp and things. And he was sent to do a mission over in Europe, and then he came back early He was then made the bishop, I think it was, in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, he started he wanted to take on the other evangelical, the other Christian groups, and convert them. And so he began to have debates, and he was doing really well in these debates. From all accounts, he was kind of doing extremely well, until they got to the point of the Book of Mormon where they said, well, your Book of Mormon talks about this highly advanced civilization with roads and cities and a written language and so forth. Where are they? I mean, we have these Native Americans, and at the time they were being called ignorant savages because of a couple of other books which we've addressed with Stephen Smoot has addressed those with the Lost Civilizations of North America documentary and other things. But there was a deliberate, there were several things coming together at the same time. There was a deliberate effort to try to undermine how advanced the ancient civilizations in North America were, for basically American Manifest Destiny doctrine, which was basically that when the Europeans came over to America, they found these savages here. They didn't have language, they didn't have cities and roads. They kind of just lived off the land. They were berry and nut hunters, and that was kind of the narrative that was being told at the time. And then there's also things like the idea of evolution was involved with this. Basically, that these people had darker skin, and so they weren't as advanced genetically as the whites who were coming over from Europe. So they were kind of a subhuman species. So that way we wouldn't allow them to vote or own land or those kind of things, because they weren't really quite 100% human. This is a result of the idea of evolution. If we came from apes, basically, and this is what Charles Darwin surmised, if we came from apes and apes were basically black, then the darker your skin was, the less evolved towards whiteness you were. It's incredibly racist, but that's what evolution was kind of preaching at the time. Anyway, so there was a guy by the name of there was Lewis Henry Morgan and Ephraim George Squires, it was Lewis Henry Morgan. He wrote a book called Ancient Societies, and he actually had correspondences back and forth with Charles Darwin about evolution and so forth. And he wrote a book called Ancient Societies, wherein he was the one that actually came up with 3 categories of evolving. So you have the ignorant savages, and then you have the he basically religious people were kind of next up on the thing, and then there's the fully evolved
enlightened man.
Yeah. So what he called civilization. Mm-hmm. And then he was the one that labeled the Native Americans as ignorant savages. He was the one that put that in there, and he and John Wesley Powell had just started the Bureau of Ethnology, and which ultimately became the Smithsonian Institution, and they had huge influence on the United States government. So the government began to look upon the Native Americans as subhuman, and so that way we could subjugate them, and otherwise Christian people would take away their rights and their lands and so forth. But that was what was going on at the time of Joseph Smith. People don't realize that this was all happening at that time. People are trying to figure out things. There was 2 guys that went down, Stevens and Catherwood. They took a trip down to Central America, and when they got into Central America, they found these amazing ruins of all these different places like Chichen Itza and so forth. They had these ruins, and they came back and they wrote a 2-book set, which actually became known. In fact, it was the first ever New York Times bestseller. Was this set of books. That's where the term New York Times bestseller came from. And so they were going up and down the East Coast of the United States promoting their books to the people, and the Americans were just like dumbfounded that there was these amazing civilizations. They're all covered with jungle today, just lost civilizations. And it was kind of a sexy romantic thing about going down and discovering this ancient civilization. And so when Benjamin Winchester was having these debates, he knew about this New York, this book, which was taking America by storm. And he thought, if I could just link the Book of Mormon with this New York Times best-selling set of books. I mean, how cool would that be? I mean, people would believe the Book of Mormon if they saw the ruins and so forth that they're talking about in these books. And so he began to openly talk about the books that were being promoted by Stevens and Catherwood is the same civilization that's being talked about in the Book of Mormon, with the big cities and the big pyramids and everything. And and he started to win the argument.
What's interesting with that too, because I've done a little research on this, is that who really adopts that hook, line, and sinker is the reorganized church.
Oh yeah,
they take that as gospel, essentially, from almost right away after the division. Right, you see the fruits of this.
But where did that come from?
That doesn't come from. Well, I'm just saying that it was different from the Latter-day Saints, right? Because the Latter-day Saints did not fully adopt that at that time. In fact, it was more thought of as being in the United States. And so you get this division of, let's call it academia to that degree, these different models that are split. And then it kind of comes back around somewhere in the 20th century, where in the second half of the 20th century, it starts getting adopted pretty firmly within the Latter-day Saints, as being the Mesoamerican model.
So where did the reorganized get their information from? And part of that has to do with this Benjamin Winchester. So he started to really do well in these debates. Then he found out that Joseph Smith's little brother had died working on the Times and Seasons there in Nauvoo. And so he wrote a letter, which is extant. We still have the original letter where he wrote to Joseph Smith, said, "Man, who could possibly replace Don Carlos, who just died, working at the Times and Seasons?" He had a newspaper there in Philadelphia, and it was going broke. He wasn't getting enough subscribers to do it. It was killing him financially. So he thought, I'm going to go to Nauvoo. So he actually just up and leaves Philadelphia, goes to Nauvoo. He ends up volunteering and becoming part of the Times and Seasons, and he and William were actually running the Times and Seasons for a while. They began to promote this idea of Central America, and Joseph Smith 3 different times reprimanded him over it. But the first time he said, it actually, if you can imagine, Times and Seasons is kind of like the Lehi, the Ensign was, before it was like the church magazine. And he was censured by Joseph Smith and the Quorum of the 12. Benjamin Winchester is hereby censored from any further preaching or whatever after he did the first time, and then he repented and so forth. And so Joseph and Brigham and everybody kind of brought him back in, and then he did it a second time, where he promoted the Central America thing. He and William were colluding with each other in the Times and Seasons, and Joseph Smith was I mean, we have all the documentation and so forth that he was all over he didn't have time. We know that he wasn't actively editing everything that was going in the Times and Seasons. He had turned it over to the 12. In fact, there was a part in the Times and Seasons where he says, I am now turning it all over to the 12. He said, the only thing I'm going to be responsible for is the stuff that has my signature henceforward. And these articles didn't have his signature. They had the editor's signature. Anyway, so long story short is that over the course of time, these guys ended up, specifically Benjamin Winchester, he converted one of the other apostles at the time, and the two of them ended up actually suing each other over who going to get credit for the Central American theory. They broke off from the church, were excommunicated, and they were the ones that started some of the RLDS stuff that ended up promoting the Central American stuff, because these guys were the ones who started it.
Now, it's interesting, Rod, because today, right, you've got very much, how do I say this? I don't even know if there's we don't talk about this enough, except I guess in some of the circles you're in, but it's there's, let's call it the LDS establishment, where you have a narrative of Mesoamerica. It's firm too. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, these organizations use Mesoamerican logos basically for their organizations. It's
the glyphs.
It's like they're dug in right with their heels on this geography. I don't know why. I don't know why it would be that way, but obviously they feel that there is enough evidence for them that this is that this is where it was and it took place in Mesoamerica. But then you have, at the same time, it seems, I mean, I don't know how far back you'd go with this, but at least 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
Where the Mesoamerican model has become more and more entrenched, right? Going back probably to the 70s.
More and more mainstream. Yeah.
More and more mainstream, right? With Mesoamerica. But now there is kind of a backlash to this. I mean, you look at what you've got with your organization and Wayne May and what he does, and Neville and all these scholars, lay scholars that are out now looking at this in a different way. Well, that Heartland model is growing.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm speaking as an agnostic here. I'm completely agnostic on this. But that Heartland model is growing pretty quickly. And people are looking at this like, wait a minute here. This hegemonic model of Mesoamerica, there may be some issues here that we find, but it's still...
You hit on it already.
The major push, right, that you have with that narrative. For example, everybody's been really excited about reading the volumes of the saints, right? And reading these books, they're fascinating. You get all this history in there. It's great, but you have in volume 1, there isn't a single mention of Cumorah. Cumorah in that volume 1 of Saints.
When we brought it up,
not even with a parentheses or a qualifier saying, well, this is what they thought it was and it was traditional. It's not even mentioned.
Yeah. When we actually brought it up to the church history committee that was overseeing the writing of the Saints volumes, they said, well, that there's another side that thinks that that's not really the Hill Cumorah. And we said, well, it really shouldn't matter what they think. What should matter is what Joseph Smith said, especially when he said in Revelations, are you really going to just dismiss the wording that was actually penned from the Revelations of Joseph Smith and change that in order to accommodate the Central American theory? And he said, well, yeah.
That's
but you hit
interesting. Things just become political.
You already hit on.
It's like everything. Water runs down here. Everything becomes political. I'm shocked that I'm not shocked. It's just if you're going to have history looked at, you have to have different perspectives. Everyone's going to have a different perspective, and you have to look at those things.
Yeah,
and what you represent is scholarship. What you represent is the words of the scriptures, just as much as anybody on the Mesoamerican side. And you've gone through your 4 areas here with the scriptures and with physical evidence and with the prophecies, etc. And so it's odd to me that and this is the way everything always works, right? Right. It's you have a development of a gatekeeping crowd that say we're going to hold the narrative here, and again, to me, maybe the narrative's right. I don't know, but I don't like the idea of the gatekeeping. That I don't like that at all. That is sowing seeds that are going to bear bad fruit.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you already mentioned that is really in my journey through this process. I mean, once I looked at the DNA research, the DNA information, then that led to what did Joseph Smith know about this, and that really led to, well, there's these prophecies and promises that you mentioned about Bruce Porter and I's book about the prophecies and promises, and I said, how do we get around these revelations and so forth, where Joseph Smith and it's not just Joseph Smith, it's the Lord. He sends missionaries to the Lamanites, and he sends them to the Heartland of to Ohio and Missouri and New York. But then you have the DNA evidence, and then I tell you that the biggest thing to me is the prophecies. It's that you can argue about narrow necks of land all day long. What constitutes a narrow neck of land? Where is it? How narrow is it? How wide is it? I mean, you can speculate about all those kind of things. But when it comes down to the 36 prophecies in the Book of Mormon that talk about a mighty Gentile nation that's going to be established and raised up and lifted up. And 8 times in the Book of Mormon, they call it the land of liberty. They say it was be a land of prosperity and security. When you start adding up the 36 prophecies, Greg, there's only one nation in the Americas that fit all 36 of those prophecies. And that is the United States of America. And so we've been called, well, you guys are just trying to play on people's nationalism and their patriotism. And
yeah,
so
that bothers me too.
I said the same exact thing. I went up into Canada just a couple of years ago. I did several presentations up through Canada. And as I was going up there, I was traveling up there, I said, okay, so I should probably tone down the America thing just a little bit, because the Canadians they may be a little bit, offended by the fact that we're talking about the United States as the promised land and they're kind of not included or whatever kind of thing. And as I was going up there, I was pondering how I would do that. And basically the thought just came to my mind, whose revelations are they? They weren't mine. I'm just telling what the revelation said. So just tell what the revelation said. And if it's and if it offends someone, I'm sorry, but this is what God's word is. I'm not going to be offended over God's word. So I went up there to the Canadian saints and I told them about how the United States is the promised land. This is the nation that God raised up men specifically for its foundation, the founding fathers. He's never said that about any other nation. He talked about it being a nation among other nations. So it's not talking about a nation like Israel or the nation of African or whatever. He's talking about a nation within other nations. And then when you look at the prophecies in the Book of Mormon that talk about, for example, the New Jerusalem, you have in Ether, you have the prophet bearing testimony, basically that he lives on the land that one day will become the New Jerusalem. And then when Moroni gets the plates, the plates from Ether, the Jaredite plates, basically, then he seconds it. So here's Moroni saying, well, the first prophet got it right. I'm a prophet, and I'm telling you that the New Jerusalem is going to be on our land in the future. And then the Lord tells Joseph Smith in 3 different revelations exactly and precisely where the New Jerusalem is going to be built. And it's not in Guatemala, and it's not southern Mexico. It's in the heartland of the United States, basically where the Adam and Eve were, the original promised land.
But wait a minute. So what about the clarification? Because there could be 2 different things. This is what I've heard, right? There could be 2 different things here. One is where did the Book of Mormon take place?
Yeah.
Right. That where's the land of the Lamanites and the Nephites? Where did this take place? That's one. The second one would be the promised land, which would be not necessarily talking just where the nation is in that area or the place where the Nephites and Lamanites were, but perhaps this is the entire hemisphere, right? It's the North and South America, and that all is all the promised land. Is that something that fits into your model?
And that's something that we needed to have some answers for, because obviously, because there were people in Joseph Smith's day who were hemispheric. Basically, they believe the Book of Mormon happened in North and South America, and there was this narrow neck of land.
Yeah, very common narrative.
Panama, and you look at a map today and go, well, gee, I mean, that's obvious. I mean, there's the narrow neck of land. But this is the reason why we ended up with the Heartland research and the Mesoamerican stuff, because when you actually analyze the travel distances talked about by when Alma travels and so forth, and he goes for several days and he sees several cities and so forth, right? The indications are that the geography of the Book of Mormon doesn't extend for 4,000 or 5,000 miles. There's just not enough time to see the cities that they go and see. They go down to Lamanite territory, they go up in the Nephite territory, and it all happens in just a few months. That's not possible if the Lamanites are in South America and the Nephites are in North America. It's just too big. People realize that the geography passages pretty much eliminate the idea that the Book of Mormon happened in the entire hemisphere. So then if it's limited, how limited is it? I mean, is it just a few 100 miles? Is it 1,000 miles? Is it in North America or Central America? Because it can't really be in both. It's just the distances are too great to be in one or the other. So they said, well, since the Native Americans up here were illiterate and didn't have, well, at the time they thought they didn't have a written language, they didn't have, a culture, that was a mighty culture and so forth. They said, well, then the obvious choice is the Central American idea, because the Mayans, through Stevens and Catherwood, we know that they were a big culture. They were advanced. They had the written language, although the written language has nothing to do with Hebrew. It's as different as Latin is to Chinese. I mean, they're not in any way related with each other. But nevertheless, they had a written language at least, and they're saying the Native Americans up here didn't have that. So that became kind of the de facto thing is, well, where do we have the biggest, most advanced culture? If it's going to be limited somewhere, then the most advanced culture at the time seemed to be Mesoamerica. It's only been the last 15 or 20 years when the incredible advancements of the North American Hopewell culture has been really coming out archaeologically, where we now know that they had 2 or 3 million mounds. They did have some written language, because there's been at least 7 different places in North America where this written language has been discovered, and that written language just happens to be, oh yeah, Paleo-Hebrew. Yeah, Hebrew stuff on stones.
Though? Is that Paleo-Hebrew confirmed as being authentic?
Well, okay, and this is where,
because I've read both sides of that, and there's plenty of people that are going to go right against that statement.
Yep, you're gonna say no way. But the arguments against it basically have been the first time it was actually discovered by the Smithsonian in an official archaeological dig was the Bat Creek stone, which was there wasn't any LDS people involved with it. They dug down into this mound on the Tennessee River, basically where the Tennessee goes into the Ohio, or pretty close to there. It's called Bat Creek. And they were digging into this mound, and they found these skeletons, and they dug down. They found the body of this guy was kind of separate from the other. There's about I think there was 8 or 9 skeletons facing one direction, one burial, and there was one other guy facing the opposite direction. And then they got down to underneath his rib cage, and there was a little stone that they found there. And the guy called Emmert, was his name, was the head of the dig. And he basically made an etching where you would take a pencil and kind of just go over the top of it on a piece of paper and kind of etch it. And he sent it into the Smithsonian and said, wow, it's some kind of written language, but it looks like some kind of, they call it Paleo-Hebrew. And they published it in one of the Smithsonian's publications as this is some kind of a Paleo-Cherokee thing. We don't know what it is. 75 years later, there were some experts, epigraphers, that actually took a look at the Smithsonian document, but they turned it upside down, and it's perfectly legible Hebrew that says, for the Judeans. And all of a sudden, for 75 years, that stone wasn't controversial. All of a sudden, it became controversial because, oh, we can't have Hebrews here in America, because that might actually support the Bible claims of the 10 tribes being driven off and so forth, and then the worst part of it is this upstart church called the Mormon Church. Basically, at that point in time, they have this prophet. He claims to be a prophet, this Joe Smith, who says that there's this. You've got these records that have this record of this ancient people here, and they were Hebrews. Gosh, if this is true, that actually would lend support to the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, and we can't be having that now, can we? Now, people say, well, wait a minute, that's kind of crazy. I mean, why would anybody care about Joseph Smith? Well, the reason why they cared is because the 2 guys who were in charge of the Smithsonian at the time, which was Powell and John Wesley Powell and Lewis Henry Morgan, okay, they were the ones who were starting that. It just so happens that, guess what? Their dads, both of their fathers, just happened to be Methodist ministers in Palmyra, New York in 1830. You don't think that those guys knew about this upstart young prophet and this claim of the gold plates and this highly advanced civilization? So they knew if they could somehow discredit these artifacts that have Hebrew on them, that would also tend to discredit Joseph Smith and his story and the Book of Mormon. So they deliberately used the clout of the Smithsonian to basically claim, well, language doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, if you find one stone with some Hebrew on it, doesn't mean that everybody was speaking Hebrew, which is true. But when you have, but then another stone comes out, and another stone, and another stone, you have the Newark holy stones, for example. They have the 10 Commandments in Hebrew on them, or you have these other stones that have Hebrew, and each time they say, well, you can't have language in a vacuum. But now we have 7 different stones. But this is an interesting thing, though, Greg. In the Book of Mormon, the narrative is that the Lamanites hated the Nephites, and the Lamanites were determined to destroy the Nephite history. That's why they had to hide the records in the Hill Cumorah. Do you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if the Lamanites were determined to destroy their history, that means they're going to destroy their language. How much language would we expect to find of a people who were wiped out, and the people who were remaining for several hundreds of years were determined to wipe out their history, to delete anything? All you have to do is go to Egypt, and you find out that every succeeding ruler, the first thing they do is they go to all the obelisks and they have the previous ruler's stuff, chiseled out.
Yeah, to the victor goes the spoils and the history.
Exactly.
It always.
And so this is what exactly was happening. And so you wouldn't expect to find hardly any language left over, but yet we have a little bit. But down in Central America, the Mayans, their language is everywhere. It's on every monument, every wall. There's nothing that's been wiped out, and it's the wrong language in the first place.
So what about the argument, Rod, of yeah, but the Lamanites will blossom as a rose, and look at all the baptisms that we have in Latin America as compared to with the Native Americans. I mean, it's not even close, right? I mean, you've got obviously a larger population, but I mean, so much of the church still is growing, and the conversions are, at their highest levels, aside from maybe Africa and the Philippines in Latin America. Yeah.
Well, and that's something that I've had to, take a hard look myself, because people say, well, you guys are anti-Hispanic, or something. It's like, no, we're not. I have good friends of mine and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of Hispanic people who actually embrace the Heartland research and the Heartland model because it matches with what Joseph Smith and the Revelations say. But back to the blossoming as a rose, when Elder Native American, he was the head of the BIA, actually. It's Elder
Eagle
Echo Hawk. Yeah, Larry Echo Hawk. Yeah, when he was first asked, when he first became a general authority, he was asked to give a talk, and you can actually go back. I think it was in 2012 or 2013. He gave his first talk in general conference in general conference. Anyway, so in his talk, he actually talks about his background, his heritage, and how his people were on the Trail of Tears, and it matches up with the how they would be persecuted and driven and so forth. And he said, my people have suffered that. They would be driven off their lands. And then he says, and someday we will all be part of this blossoming of a rose. That was in 2012. Apparently the blossoming had not happened, at least to that point. He told me that the first presidency reviewed his talk personally and had it approved. So it had at least run through that process. Mm-hmm. So back to the blossoming of a rose. So what exactly is the blossoming of the rose? And if it hadn't happened by 2012, has it happened yet? My answer to that is basically, it's so funny. So many things are just right under our noses and we just don't even see it. But because the Native Americans of the Algonquin speaking group, so there's like this 110 tribes, because they looked so much like Europeans, they intermarried with Europeans almost on first contact. They had the Europeans had no problem with intermarrying with these Native Americans and vice versa. There was a lot of that went on. I mean, we know about the Pocahontas and so forth, right? Anyway, so there was a lot of this intermarrying that went on. And in fact, when the Indian Removal Act happened, You ever heard of the term hillbillies?
Mm-hmm.
You know where that term comes from? Is actually Native Americans and the European immigrants basically had intermarried, and then they were living in places, you know, in Missouri and Tennessee and that whole kind of Appalachia area. And when the Indian Removal Act came, the Indian agents came out to remove them, and they were married to, you know, to immigrants, you know, the Europeans. And so rather than break their families up and have the Native American side of the family taken off to a reservation, they would just go up and disappear in the hills. And the Indian agents said they would go into places that even billy goats couldn't get to. So they called them hillbillies. That they would go up and disappear until the Indian agents would go away, and then they would come back and live their lives. But so there was a lot of intermixing between Native American populations and the European population early on. That continues on. I have asked groups of 1,000 people before, how many of you have Native American ancestry? Now, these are all mostly, you know, probably 99% members of the church. All, I'd say probably 90% were Caucasians, right? And I'm telling you, half the hands go up.
Yeah.
Because now people are trying to find out what the Native American DNA is. And with DNA studies now, we find out that many members of the church have it. And I think that's part of the blossoming. It's right under our noses. It's been blossoming right under our noses. We don't even realize it.
I want to finish up with this. This is something that fascinates me in good discussion so far, but I'm fairly new to the Heartland model. I spoke at your conference a year ago. Yeah. Spoke in April.
By the way, you were awesome.
Weeks here. Happy to do that. Love the people there. I've met so many wonderful, great people there, and gotten some real good information that I didn't have before. But there is this odd political divide between what I would have, say, for example, with people I know in the Maxwell Institute, or even in some CES, right? And then over with those that would follow the Heartland model.
Yeah.
Right. So the Heartland model seems to be there, you know, again, if we go back and look at what is the mainstream LDS academic narrative of Mesoamerica and the seer stone, those two things.
Yeah.
You then get this rebounding effect with the Heartland movement. And inevitably, if I were to line up everyone at one of your conferences or everyone that was on the other side of this, I'm going to get at least a 90% rate of guessing where you stand politically. And it's, you know, to me, politics is not just a matter of, well, what party do I vote for and what issues do I vote for? I think it is a personality. There are personality traits there that say you're a traditionalist, for example, right? And so you're more conservative, and you're going to be a little bit more, I think, defensive of certain things than those that would be more liberal, right? They're not going to be, that's what a liberal is, right? Being liberal means opening those things up more. And being conservative means conserving that status quo a little bit more.
Exactly.
What do you see the dynamic there of because it's, I don't know, it always comes down to politics. And is it just that certain people with a certain personality type are going to lean toward a Heartland model, and those that have a different political mindset are going to lean toward, you know, a Mesoamerican model? It is a political divide. It may not start out that way. It may not be that's what is distinguishing the two, right? I think it's scholarship that distinguishes the two, and research, but there is a political divide. Why don't you speak to that?
There's so many things we could talk about with that. I guess it would come down to the political divide. I think, and you already kind of mentioned this, basically progressive ideologies are ones that say, well, you know, okay, we have what's been in the past, but we want to move forward. We want to, you know, progress in the sense that what was in the past is old school, and what's in the future is going to be better, because we have to be progressing towards something. And I agree with that. The conservative side of things is, what we had in the past has not been bad. It's pretty good. Let's take what we know from the past that's worked and continue on with that. I will have to say that as a general rule, so let me throw out some things that are kind of the dividers, some of the dividers as I see it. So, for example, the Book of Mormon happened in Central America or North America. We're North America, that we have those who do the Central America stuff. The same people who promote the Central American theories are also usually fairly open to the ideas of evolution, for example. That maybe God kind of directed it, but ultimately it was natural forces that basically over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, has led to the animal kingdom that we see today. Versus the more conservative side is the Bible and the Popol Vuh and the Torah and the Quran and all these ancient histories, basically they all claim that basically men were put here and we didn't evolve from that standpoint. So that would be a conservative viewpoint. Another conservative viewpoint would be basically Noah's flood. From a geological standpoint, people say, well, there's no evidence that there was a worldwide flood. I mean, where would all the water come from, and where did it all go, and how do you explain all that? And there hasn't been any really good answers for that, but people have just, and the Christian community as a general rule still holds to that idea. That's why we have the Ark encounter and so forth going on there in Kentucky and other places. But the conservative view is that, okay, it happened. We can't explain why or how it happened, but it happened. And the progressive view is, well, maybe it was really kind of metaphorical in nature. Maybe it was just a local flood that was kind of mythologized to the point where it actually became kind of a major narrative of humankind and so forth. But then they've got the Book of Mormon that talks about that after the floodwaters receded from off the face of this land, if this land was the land of Adam and Eve, and that was in America, then Noah built his ark here in America, but the ark ended up over there in the mountains of Ararat in Turkey, according to the biblical sources. So if that's a local flood, or if that's a metaphoric flood, that's pretty hard to understand how that could be a metaphor. And the physical ark goes from America to Turkey. How do you metaphorically transport that ark? And if it's a local flood, I mean, that's one heck of a local flood. A local flood that covers half of the earth. So there's a divide there. What you'll find is that from a political standpoint, the same people who promote the Central American theories are the same people who promote that we came from lower life forms and through evolution and evolutionary processes, which are the same people who promote the idea that Noah's flood wasn't real, it was a myth. And there's no evidence for that, which are the same people who promote the idea that mankind has been on the earth for millions of years, that kind of plays into the whole evolution aspect of it. And then basically, and then that leads into things like, the family, the traditional family versus more progressive ideologies of what a family is, even what a woman is. I mean, they've seen that film. But so we are on the other side of this. At some point, to me, it comes down to truth, Greg. What's the truth? And some people say, well, truth is what you think it is, but I'm talking about what's God's truth. What really happened? There's only one truth out there. And if there, and for me and my family and my background and my personality is that if there is something that the scriptures say happened, and it's and that is, and we can understand the scriptures properly, so we know it really did, okay, and science doesn't support that position, one of them's wrong. I mean, if science is saying this and religion is saying that, and they're not meshing, they're colliding with each other. One of them's wrong. And at some point, you just have to make a decision which one you're going to believe.
Yeah.
Because they can't both be right. And for me, basically, which one is it? I believe that when science collides with the gospel truths, the truths that we know from the gospel, when there's a discrepancy between those two, science is wrong. And the gospel's got it right. And at some point, science will have to adjust itself to conform to the truths of the gospel. But there's a lot of people in the church who believe the other way, that at some point the church is going to have to change its positions to align itself with science. That's the opposite of what I believe.
Yeah, and that's the battle. It always has been. And again, there's so much good that I believe, that comes out of academia, and yes, I'm a voracious reader and read a lot of the scholars and have very good friends that are scholars. But
academics never been wrong.
It's Jerusalem versus Alexandria. It's Jerusalem versus Athens. This always happens. And then eventually you end up with the philosophies of men that end up taking over a narrative that are anti-religious, and it's a problem because for me, it's a little different. I feel like I have to walk the sword of truth's edge on these things sometimes, because I can pick some things over here and I can pick some things over here, and I'm not always comfortable in either place, but
I think God does that. God is a God of dichotomies. That's one thing I've come to the conclusion.
Definitely.
I mean, on the one hand, he says, "Thou shalt not kill," and he tells Nephite,
"Yes,
Laban is a bad dude. Get rid of him."
Yep. Take care of him.
Or Captain Moroni, if you don't take the oath, then we're going to put you to death. I mean, but he's held up as one of the greatest heroes in the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
I think God does that on purpose because it makes you make a choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have to decide which side you're going to be on.
Rod, tell us more about the FIRM Foundation conference coming up here in September.
Yeah, so we have we have these semi-annual conferences. Basically, we try to do them in the vicinity of general conference, so that when people are coming for general conference, they can stay an extra few days and then come to our conference. That's why we call it the International Book of Mormon Evidence Conference. I think we're at 32 consecutive now.
Wow.
So it's been quite a while. It's interesting. One thing I wanted to point out, though, and that is that we've been talking about how it's kind of been mainstreamed about Central America, that Central America is the thing. I'd like to change that narrative, actually, because I don't think it is. I think mainstream is now Heartland, and the sideliners are the Mesoamerica. Few people are still desperately clinging on to the idea that that tapirs are horses, and that we don't need any DNA information and so forth. The reason why I say that is because if you take a look at the top selling books at Deseret Book involving Book of Mormon geography, the Heartland research has absolutely dominated. There's been maybe 2 or 3 books about geology in the Book of Mormon, which he starts off with the assumption that the Book of Mormon couldn't have happened in North America because there's no volcanoes, even though the fact is that there's no volcanoes mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So there's been a few Mesoamerica books, but none of them have actually gone really anywhere. Bruce and I's book, the Prophecies and Promises, was our first foray into this whole thing. We ended up, I think we had about probably 15 or 20,000 copies that went out, which, by the way, just as a comparison, John Sorensen's kind of the Bible, if you will, of the Mesoamerican theory.
Yeah, for a few years
John
ago.
Sorensen was kind of the main actor in that whole thing. In his book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, which I think it's right over here. Anyway, that sold 25,000 copies in 35 years. So you kind of get an idea. Then when I put out my my book called Exploring the Book of Mormon in America's Heartland, which is a picture book and so forth, and it was picked up. In fact, it's kind of funny, when Prophecies and Promises first came out, there were people who shall remain nameless that actually contacted Deseret Book and said, "This book is dangerous. You don't want to have this book on your shelves. They freaked out, pulled the book from the shelves. They had their editors and so forth pour over it with a fine-tooth comb. They came back and said it's one of the most finely researched books we've had in years. And they put it back on the shelves. But that time frame was between November and December. They put it back on the shelves in January, so we weren't able to take any advantage of the Christmas season at all.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, this is the kind of stuff that has gone on. But then when I came out with the Exploring the Book of Mormon, that one has had now 7 printings and over about 65,000 copies have gone out, which is twice what John Swartzon's book has done. Then when we came out with the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon, which has the Heartland research embedded in it, that's now the best-selling edition of the Book of Mormon in the church, basically. So who is mainstream now?
Mm-hmm.
I think the most interest can be shown by how many people come to conferences. We have 7,500 people attend these at our conference. FIRM Mormon, Maxwell Institute, if they get 200 or 300 people at their conferences, that's a pretty good sized conference for them. Maybe 300, but they won't get anywhere close to what we get at our conferences.
Yeah, that's true. And I think we're the mainstream. I was just at FAIR, and and I love the stuff they do. I love the stuff they do. It's they need to cater outside of academia a little more, right? Yeah. They kind of go for a bubble a little bit. And
if we can ever get our stuff together, the power that would be there with their influence, their knowledge, their ability to get information out and so forth, with the information that we have with the Heartland research, I think we could finally take the Book of Mormon to the world, which is what we've been infighting. I look at it like a football team, since we're coming into football season here. Anyway, we have 2 teams on the field. They have the Lord's side and Satan's side, right? And here we have the Lord's side over here arguing about, did it happen in North America or Central America, North America, Central America? Basically, we're like, do we do an end run or do we do a long bomb pass? And while we're sitting there arguing about it, Satan's team is kicking our butts down the field. Let's get ourselves together. The Lord says, if you're not one, you're not mine. And we've actually tried our best to try to do that. That's why you won't find any attack articles against Central America on our websites, but you will find their websites filled with attack articles against the Heartland research. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, that actually turns them way off. They go, you know what? Why would they be attacking it so hard if it's a nothing burger?
Yeah, yeah. So what are the dates of your conference coming up? Is it 15th to 16th? Yeah, it's the 15th and 16th. It's a Friday, Saturday. We usually have them 3 days. In the spring, we usually have them for 3 days. It's the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We just honestly couldn't find a venue. Our conferences are getting so big. There's only about 3 or 4 places in the state that can even handle the size of the event. So we had like 230 vendors, and we have last time in the spring we had, when you were speaking, it was I think there was like 85 or 90 speakers and 130 classes in 3 days. I mean, it's almost like a mini education week. Yes. But
not endorsed by the church. I want to make sure that people understand it, But when we have non-members come and speak, and I had people at the last one that came and actually just kind of broke down all the different theories. There's been 150 different geography theories that have been proposed. And it reminds me of Joseph Smith in his day, the confusion over the scriptures. I mean, they're, all these different denominations, but they're all using the same darn book. Why don't we use the book that we have, the Book of Mormon, get together as one and take this message to the world, because the world needs it, especially now.
Yes. Right. Really appreciate your time. The FIRM Foundation Conference then is September 15th and 16th. I'm speaking in the evening of the 15th, in the morning of the 16th. So I hope those that are listening and are in northern Utah or beyond can make their way to the Hilton downtown in Salt Lake.
Yeah, can I just, so I think we have about 60 speakers this time. Because it's only 2 days, we don't have as many speaking slots, but we have 7 presentations about the Constitution. That's another area that we differ. We feel like the Constitution is inspired of God, The more progressive people feel like the Constitution was okay for its time, but it needs to be revamped and updated because we've moved on from that. We have Kate Dalley's going to be speaking. You're actually keynote speaker, so that's why we want to thank you, Greg, for being willing to come. But we have some kind of controversial people too. In fact, so controversial were we that LDS Living actually canceled us. We got canceled. 12 years I've advertised with LDS Living magazine, and the last
Wow.
seminar they said there's somebody that we don't like. They're critical of BYU or something like that, and I'm like, well, there's some things that are going on, not BYU as a whole, but there's some aspects and areas of BYU that need some correcting, and I think the brethren already been working on that. In fact, I think you mentioned it in a couple of your podcasts previously.
Yes.
But we have Cindy Biggs. You probably know her from Andy Biggs. He's the
Arizona
Arizona State Senator there. She's coming and talking about that. And then we have Chuck Castleberry, Jonathan Neville's coming. I mean, we've got a huge lineup of amazing people that are going to be speaking, and so we want to encourage everybody to come out. It's a 2-day pass for basically for $45. I mean, for 2 days of intensive research, that's cheap.
We'll make sure that we put the description and a link to all that in the description box for everyone who's watching this. So, Rod, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We need to do it again.
Thank you, brother. And we're gonna be firing up our podcast as well. So I want to have you come and talk on ours when we get to that point. Thank you, Greg. Take care.